leave his focus.
I mean, people are going to use this live series just to track his skill development. Absolutely.
Finely trained animal. You might have noticed last time he actually likes to rub his face on the hitting screen. So if you see him like walking back and forth, that's what he's doing, Terry.
Are you sure it's his face?
When Matt Rudy's been here, that's what Matt does too.
Well, welcome down. We have a new guest this week that we're excited about, Terry Rowles. Terry, welcome.
Thanks, Scotty. Very happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Matt, why don't you know Terry pretty well. Why don't you provide us a little bit of context, a little bit of history on Terry for our viewers here.
Just the good stuff.
I do know Terry, and one of my favorite attributes for any teacher that I deal with, and Nick falls in the same category, is teachers who want to know. Teachers who want to find out more information, better information. They're always looking for the stuff that can improve what they do, and I look at it as improving the processing speed of your computer, which then allows you to present quicker, more accurate information to the person in front of you. And it's been really, really fun to spend a lot more time with Terry over the last little while, because we've got some fun projects that we're working on together, and it's going to be a nice day for me because I get to bring a couple of my buddies together, Nick and Terry. Hopefully you won't start some raging fist fight here in front of me today that'll make me come and break it up, but I'm really looking forward to see what you guys have to say to each other.
I think we'll be okay, but thanks for your concern. Terry, where are you at right now?
Fight would be.
I'm in Arizona.
Arizona to Denver. I can't reach that far. You'll be just fine.
Okay, good.
So I did want to talk to you. You live in the 6 degree of freedom land of measuring swings like I do, which is awesome. It's fun to talk to people like that. Not everybody has that same background, Terry. Not sure if you know that.
It's no, I'm very aware, and it's a very special subset of people that like to see things like that.
Well, yeah. No,
I think it's. But when you think of the category of coaches that live in that world but also teach tour players, you guys are also in that small circle of trust. So to be around guys that not only are willing to look at data more exhaustively, be open to new information, and also have the touch point artistry to share it with the best players in the world and have them actually receive it, that's a pretty small group.
Agreed. So I'm curious then, Terry, you're doing some new research on the grip and how turning your hand to the left or to the right really changes a multitude of things. Can you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah. So I also, had an indoor school probably like 2005 through 2012 in San Francisco, and used a lot of data. And very early on, when I got a launch monitor and combined the launch monitor stuff and the motion capture stuff together, it became pretty obvious that there was some very distinct patterns that started to correlate. At that time we were talking, the average kind of kinematic sequence and the average, kind of bullfight stuff. And it was kind of obvious that there was a, relationship between kind of the way that some of the graphs were showing up versus what we were seeing on the launch monitor. And so even probably in about, 2009, 10, 11, I was doing a test, where basically you get someone to close the face and tell them to hit it straight, and then open the face and tell them to hit it straight. And the interesting part, if you don't learn anything else from this podcast or webinar today, is that how did they hit it straight? And it's, target awareness, right? And so if you just said to them, close the face and hit it, they would have hit it, in the direction of the face, right? And so that's in its own right, that was actually my biggest lesson of this whole thing. And so what happens is everything they do that changes, that we measure, that is different, is a face opener or a face closer contribution on some level, right? And so what we saw was, it's pretty clear just by doing that, that, side bend became really apparent as the biggest thing. And then as we go along here and start talking about how we control the rate of closure, for example, the side bend definitely relates to the trail arm action. So then,
to stop you right there, was it the side bend at impact or in the downswing?
Yes, impact. Yeah. So when you start looking at club face, you see, side bend being the biggest kind of relationship to
Sure.
club face.
Yeah.
So we go through that, and I presented that at the World Golf Science thing, just saying basically, if you change your club face, the swing changes in these predictable ways. But it wasn't really enough because we didn't know, how much. And so I started nagging Phil Cheatham to create a way to, who developed your system, I understand, to develop a way to measure the grip, right? And so understand how much grip change actually makes a difference, right? And so we went backwards and forwards, and Phil came up with a way to create a grip. And so basically it was a relationship between the club face and the hands, which is a big difference, right? And so now Phil wants to rename it, and I'm pretty much with him in terms of calling it an open face or a closed face grip, right? So, so for example, you can have your hand in a certain position and the face is in a different position. So you get guys like, Luke Donald, for example, who historically set up with the face pretty closed. And then you get guys like, Rory McIlroy, who sets up with the face relatively open. And so you can look at a picture of a grip and it doesn't really mean much unless you know what the relationship of the hands is to the club face, right? And so, so you potentially could have a neutral grip and a ton of side bend, and we're like, wow, it doesn't make any sense. But when we actually measure the grip and measure the club face, and it absolutely makes a difference. So now we got numbers on grips, right? So you could have the grip ranges, pretty close to 0 would be about the weakest grip. You could have up to about 35 to 38 degrees would be one of the stronger grips you could have. Okay. And therefore, in the side bend, for you guys who do 6th off, side bend will go anywhere from low 20s to high 30s, basically. And, those two would correlate. So then I started talking with Mike. So it's actually funny. I saw Mike present, and I really enjoyed his presentations, Mike Adams. And, we got talking, and, he was testing then for grips, left hand, right hand independent of each other. And we were just looking at it as a grip, right? And so probably at that time I was teaching global grip and the associated kind of movement patterns that go with each of those, which I still do, but now it's a lot more precise. And so doing the testing with Phil, we were able to associate in line with what Mike was finding, that the trail hand has a lot more effect on the variables that are affected by club face. So, side bend is much more correlated to side bend than the lead hand, for example, which is a lot more correlated to, kind of how the pivot is and what have you. So it's a little bit of a different thing. So now we're going to talk about the trail hand grip and the trail arm. So if you think about the degrees of freedom that trail arm goes through, I hope this is a pretty smart group. I'm going to go. So if you look at an arm, right, it starts out, in front of you, AB ducts, the arm flexors, there's external rotation, all the stuff that goes on in the wrist, and elevation, and all of that has to be undone at some point in the downswing, right? And so if you imagine you have a more closed or more open club face, you have to undo it in different ways and at different times. And so we brought in Sasha McKenzie to look at the data, and he actually did a terrific job of organizing all the databases that we had, in a very cool way that we can compare all the variables against each other more easily. So these guys are much smarter than us golf teachers, by the way.
Well, yeah. And that's why we do the same thing with our data. I don't really tell this story too much, but so we've got hundreds of thousands of swings that come in from amateur players every single year. I hand off that data to 4 PhDs that we have. They're biomechanists or data scientists, depending on their background. And then they do all the work and show me what the correlative coefficients are. Right. And then we go from there. So, I don't want to touch the data either.
Yeah, that's where we go. With the left and right hand, it was a much higher correlation coefficient. So then Sasha looked at the data, and now, so what happened in the evolution of that information is we just tested normal people, for closed and open. We then were able to isolate the variables that change when you have different club faces, and then we were able to compare that to a database of players that we've gathered over the years. And, with Phil and me and a few of our allies, we put together about 100 players and split it into pieces. And then we were able then to send that to Sasha, who processes the kind of the kinetics. And so what he was seeing is that the variable that changes is the rate at which someone closes the face, right? So if your face is already closed, you're going to hang out for a little bit relatively and close it later, right? Whereas somebody, who has a reasonably open club face, someone like Rory, for example, who, when I say open club face, I mean relative to his hand, then he's going to turn on the closing mechanism pretty early. And so that was pretty cool. And then out of that came the story about rate of closure that I'll stand to this point and say that grip is, when we say grip, we mean relationship to the club face. Relationship to the club face has got the biggest correlation to rate of closure. Now, do we need to know about it? I don't really need to know about rate of closure, but I don't teach using it. I mean, we have a pretty good idea. Actually, I saw you got a quad there. Sasha and I were in Hawaii playing around with trying to change rates of closure, and it's a pretty deep well of potential information, I guess. But I don't personally use it.
Deep well of sorrow.
Yeah. So now
there's a lot you could do. This turn your grip to the right or close it more, and then more lead wrist extension. Sort of like how you hit a bunker shot. This is usually my preferred way of slowing down that roll. Just trying to hit with my.
Yeah, let me explain. So we're talking trail arm, right? So what I've found is, we find, the story goes, we find the side bend, and then we find, degrees of freedom in the trail arm relative to the face. Now,
sure,
what we're going to see is, who's to say chicken or the egg, right? It's a very difficult one to say, and I'm telling you as a golf teacher, not a scientist, right? So if you put your hand up in front of you like this and throw a punch, go ahead and throw a punch. That's not a very good punch. Matt, do that.
Duck.
So throw a punch. You see what happens when you throw a punch. Yes, exactly. You're
turning.
So the extension, basically, the extension is related to the pronation, right? And so as you straighten your arm, the hand is going to pronate or close the face.
Turn. Yep.
Correct. And so you've got, the rotation of the shoulder, the extension of the arm, all contributing to face closing, right? And so the way I look at it is like you've got a race car going around a corner, and there's two different corners, right? You've got the strong grip corner where, you have to coast for a while. Someone like Zach Johnson, right? He's going to coast and go. This is a metaphor, right? I don't want to be called out too much. I'm not a kinetic scientist, but it's a very easy way.
What you're really describing is keep the external rotation of your shoulder,
absolutely.
Keep your right arm bent more, and wait till later to straighten your arms.
Correct. Yeah. And so somebody who has got a stronger grip, like Martin Trainer, for example, he needs to get that elbow more in front of his hip, before it extends. So that's coast, go, because he doesn't need to close it. It's already closed, right? And so he has to manage the amount closed, on the way down. So then, then you got a guy, let's take someone like Pat Perez or Rory McIlroy, Mark Leishman. And then I'm going to step away from a couple of them. So basically, the elbow is going to get into a different position because it has a different job, right? So they're going to be, more Jack Nicklaus-esque, right? So the elbow is going to be, less externally rotated and stretched because that helps it adduct, whereas somebody who's more on top, those guys I'm talking about, they have a little bit more chance. Cross the line laid off's not 100% predictable, but it's pretty predictable that a guy is going to have a weaker trail hand grip is going to be a little bit more cross the line. So all that being said is that, if you look at what Pete Cowan teaches, always like you should be able to push down on a shaft. That suits those guys, right? And so they at any point in time can push, which means, the elbow, locates itself behind the hip now, not in front of the hip, and the arm extends and the hand pronates. So if you look at that like a race car, that's a fast corner, right? So they're going to go into the corner and put the gas down really early, which helps them square it up. And so those are the matchups. Now, where this all ties together, all these pieces of information is through the testing that Mike developed. So, what we find when we do the testing, for example, if you were to go back and swing a club for it, have you got a club there?
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll double check Mike's test. How about that? So if you take a club in your right hand only, and do you remember, so just do some swings, whatever, like chest high to chest high, a little bit of freedom. Perfect. So when I look at that face looks pretty stable, let's call it. Now, if you strengthen your grip and just let it, nice free swing, you'll feel how that face wants to shut down, right?
Exactly. Now that's an interesting point though, because that's sometimes where I'm starting to differentiate a little bit from that screening. So what you're demonstrating is wherever you put pressure point number 3, your index finger on your trail hand on the shaft really influences how much open or closed the face is. So why not use that
to the face? Correct. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So why not use that to help correct someone's ball flight instead
Absolutely.
of starting with what they do naturally as the way to tell someone to hold it?
Yeah, I mean, this is testing your nature on some level, because I'm going to get to the end of the story. So go ahead and put your right hand on there, you know, in a weaker. Now go ahead and swing it, and you'll probably go ahead. You feel, yeah. So we can see, just looking at that motion, that face tends to stay a little bit more open, right? So you know, there's three ways to approach what you've got there. Number one, you know, if you could put your hand on under, and we'll try and teach you a whole golf swing to stabilize that face. Number two, you know, the neutral grip seems to be, or the middle one for you seemed to be pretty good, just, you know, from this distance. In which case, now we can go into offense, right? In terms of, we can start generating speed, and we can work on the lower body action and matching arm action to start to optimize you. And then the third one, you know, you'd end up having to release it a lot earlier. You'd have a higher spin loft. Your path would be more to the left, because you're trying to overcome a face that is unnaturally open to you, right?
Well, is it unnaturally open, or is it just more predisposed to being open?
Well, for you, so this is where it all comes down to, right? So which corner are you? Are you the guy racing around the corner at great speed, or are you the guy coasting and then going?
Coasting.
No, right?
Yeah.
So depending on how you naturally stabilize a face. Now, if I give that test to Zach Johnson, for example, and he grips it weaker, or Luke Donald, I've done it with Luke Donald. If he grips it weaker, he actually will hook it. It's the opposite to you, right? So, you know, his face will close down a lot earlier. Whereas if I, like Bads, for example, if he grips it stronger, then the face will shut down really quickly. And so some of the comments he made early on when he changed his trail hand grip to being weaker is, I can't believe how, you know, stable the face feels. You know, there's none of that kind of throwaway look through the ball. The face is, you know, all the things that he was kind of searching for.
Yeah, when he's playing his worst, the shaft is really twisted through the ball.
So that's the guy, like, you know, going into the corner, you know, coasting, and then putting the gas down and you know, slingshotting out of the corner, right? And it's like hold off, then go, because it's not really a style. So none of those are better than the other ones. So the point that glues all of this information together, your open face player, closed face player, you know, a coast around the corner or a gas around the corner guy is depending on what you test for, because it's a lot easier for us to build an aggressive, you know, effective golf swing around your natural tendency than it is to build everything else. You know, we call it offense or defense, right? Defense would be that face is closing down. Let's do some stuff with your swing to stop it, which basically is putting the brakes on.
Yeah. So Terry, maybe to see if I can summarize this or kind of recap this for folks. So, I mean, it's a simple test to see, you know, do you set up with a closed or open face at setup? Is that step one?
Well, I used Mike's test, right? So you fold your arms. That's the test we use. The right hand swing is kind of what we do if we're not sure, and also use it as education for people to see the benefit of gripping it their way.
Do you find most people are naturally matched up with their grip or not?
You know, the grip is an interesting question. When we started working together with Matt, he had some good statements. So the first question is, what is the grip, right? I mean, what does this golf world think a grip is? It's either strong or weak, and it's both hands, right? So when you say the grip, it actually is quite complicated and imprecise, with all due respect. So you say, well, I say which hand, right? So you go left hand, right hand. So right hand will assume that, you know, when someone says the grip, it's more right hand dominant, trail hand. And, you know, as you saw when Mike came on, you know, you do the testing and match somebody up. So now there's two things that, well, let's say there's three things that down regulate your golf swing in this case. One is trying to achieve TrackMan numbers that don't suit your style. So, for example, if you know, somebody's got a reasonably weak grip tendency, like Brooks Koepka, who Mike has tested, and he'll tend to, you know, hit down on it more, for example, and swing a little bit more to the left. Whereas you got somebody like you know, Dustin Johnson, if he's got a square stance, he'll tend to hit up on it more. So now just trying to achieve a TrackMan number, for example, your grip will morph to facilitate it. So that is something we run into a lot, is that people tend to get overly strong trying to hit up on it, for example. Second thing that will change it would be something along the lines of, you have to hold the angle, right? So if you have to hold your angle, then you have to develop into the guy that's holding your angle, right? Which is a stronger grip.
You're speaking more specifically towards tour player golfers?
No, everybody. I mean, people,
just depending on the instruction you're getting.
Yeah, I honestly don't remember the last time I talked about early release, because we look at that as more of a lower body timing problem than it is an upper body releasing problem. So, if you look at someone like Ben Hogan, who had a weak grip, he said, you should have 3 right hands. You look at Jack Nicklaus, he said, you can't release it early enough, right? And they're weak grip, open face players, right?
Sure.
And, if they didn't have any lower body action at all and they just sat back on their right foot, then they would release it too early, right? Because, there's no lower body action counteracting their upper body action. But, generally when I see someone releasing it too early, I'm looking firstly at the timing of their shift and, how much load, which basically means how low do they get, how much knee flex do they get, which, starts adding energy to the system. And so if you add energy to the lower body, then quite often you can continue to release it as much as you have to. Right. Or you could fix it by, putting the ball back and holding angle. Right. But what we see is that if you use it as a system of systems, you can square the face, hit the ground in the right place, and also add speed, right, which is a more offensive way of doing it.
Yeah. Terry, you mentioned Hogan in there. We had a question come in from Rob Holding.
Yeah.
He was asking, how would this be affected by players that keep the trail upper arm pinned to their ribs, aka Hogan?
That is an excellent question. I don't think, that's an excellent question. I would say, we've added a measurement, which is trail shoulder external rotation test. I think, we've got some examples like Hogan, Sergio, Cameron Champ, who I believe, and I haven't tested those guys, obviously I haven't tested Hogan, but dig him up and check out his shoulder joint. That is associated with a high level of external rotation in the shoulder. So, the amount of adduction, but, the 2 swings that are interesting in the history of golf are Nicklaus and Hogan. And you can pretty much pin any methodology on either of those and say, Hogan did this. I mean, Hogan had a very weak right hand. His elbow was out at address and he had all the characteristics of a weak grip player. His elbow would come down beside his hip, not in front of his hip. When he trained, he would do practice swings. It's kind of like Justin Rose now, right? You watch Justin Rose do his practice swings, which has kind of become a very popular thing to do. But then when you watch him swing, he doesn't have a ton of rotation through the ball. And, he doesn't really do what his practice swing looks like, right? And so I think that's a little bit feel and real with Hogan. When he talked about his swing, he talked about his elbow coming in front. Pinning arms on body is not something generally I like because, as I just mentioned, there's degrees of freedom which contribute to speed. I actually talked to Rob recently, and we were talking about sprinters, how the sprinters increase their arm speed to increase their leg speed. So if you want to put more energy into the system, pinning your limbs down and restricting motion is not what I personally do, to be honest.
So that's interesting. I know that you've been practicing with Aaron Badley a lot, who was an awesome player. It doesn't look like his arm lift or the flexion piece is really happening nearly how it did before he started working with you. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of Bads, he has feel. Every player has feels, right? So if you look at someone like Lee Trevino, he and I think it is, there's a number of measurements come into this, but let's say somebody with longer arms, somebody with shorter arms, they have different feels. So if you look at Kuchar as an example, right, he likes to get it a little bit deeper, under the plane almost, and then feel like he comes over the top like Snead, right? And then you've got Lee Trevino, took it up, likes to take it out and drop it under the plane. So the 2 guys I'm working with, trainer likes that feel, and Bads doesn't like that feel. So when you have somebody who needs to release it, needs to drive the car around the corner really fast, if they get too high, they have to coast for a moment in time to access their personal plane. And that, basically gets them a little bit too much side bend. So,
gotcha. Can I elaborate on that one a
yes.
little bit? So the higher your arm is at the top of the swing, more inflection you have in your arm. The higher the shaft starts to enter when your humerus is parallel to the ground.
Right.
So the higher that is, and what I'm talking about is the very top of the shaft, how it's going through the base of my neck here. You're set up at this point in time to slice. So to keep your swing direction to the right, you've got to avoid turning very much.
Absolutely.
Tilt yourself side bend more to the right, lower the shaft. That's where Aaron had like the worst time when I watched him hit a driver. His arms would be high, the shaft was entering about as high as anyone on the tour, and then tilting to the right, that side bend and opening the face, push cutting most of his driver.
So with that in mind, the combination, right, the trail arm grip position plus that plane enables him. So we're going to come on to talk about ground force in a little bit here, but he's predominantly we call it a spinner launcher, right? So he uses rotational force and vertical force the most. And because he's already on the left side, he doesn't need a lot of lateral force. So if you think about it, if you take the club up higher than you're naturally predisposed to, you're going to have to add lateral force, side bend, sway of the pelvis to shallow it. And that's basically a defense move to fix a swing issue, right? Whereas, if you can put it into a position where, like I say, you can just drive the car around the corner really fast without any deviation, then that's offense, and that's what we're looking for, and that ties in then to the ground force and the force production. But it's very much a correlation between the upper body and lower body to really get the most out of it.
You got it. That's where I've always seen the tour players that I've been around enough seem to play really well when they don't have much sway away from the target in the backswing, keep their arms down, and have a shaft that their hand path exits below their shoulder on the follow through. And you pretty much have a recipe for all of those guys to go out there and play really well. But I asked that question because one of the comments you made was if you want to hit it farther, you can start raising the shaft up more. It could contribute to you hitting it further, but it does seem like for the best players, that's the beginning of the problem, having the entry too high.
I remember saying that. The component of that we talked about in terms of having a free but correct arm swing. I'm not a big fan of lockdowns. So still answering Rob's question, I like all the degrees of freedom of arm motion. You talk about lead arm, for example. I mean, pinning your lead arm to your chest restricts.
Gotcha. Okay.
Sorry,
right? I just misunderstood your point. I was talking more of the flexion.
No. So so any kind of pinning, I'm not a fan, to be honest. And what you have to do is you have to solve the real problem, right? So why, for example, why would someone pin down the right arm? Well, they probably want the club to come in shallower. Why isn't it coming down shallow? Maybe the person hasn't got enough lateral force, not enough side bend, whatever it is, right?
Yeah, right.
You have to uncover the real cause rather than covering up effects, in my opinion. I mean, there's great teachers have success doing stuff like that, but I just haven't. I'm my little brain. I really like to go down to like the minutia of just do the cause and let the player solve the effect.
Yeah, well, that's an important part for a teacher, though, is that you can have as complicated of a teaching system as you want, but the words that come out of your mouth should not be hard.
That's right. So hopefully there's no players watching this show.
Oh, that's right. Can you elaborate some? So your grip study is really interesting. That would be awesome to talk about for another half an hour, but we're going to be out of time. Can you talk a little bit about the stuff you've been doing with our friend Mike Duffy? And
I really like
flex piece.
I call him Dr. No. So, we have a group of smart people around us, and we always say, what do you think of this? And one person will say, I think that, and the other person, and Duffy will be Professor Duffy, will be in the corner and not saying anything. And he'll go, well.
He's just that guy, huh? Just glass half empty all the time.
But he does think about it. Even when he's not with us, which is a terrific attribute that we really appreciate. And so we did a study with him last year because he has motion capture and force plate data combined, which is really useful. And basically we're looking at the different. Look at it in terms of your data. You have a spectrum of pelvis sway, right? So you got the green shirt guy.
Yeah.
Had to bring him in. He's very famous, by the way. But you also got, Colin Montgomery and VJ Singh. Yeah. And so basically, those guys create force in the ground, differently, right? And so we were just having a chat with Scott Lynn the other day, and he was saying, if push came to shove, what's the thing that affects ground force the most? Obviously, the thing that's closest to the ground, right, which is your lower body action. So in terms of lower body action, what Mike Duffy has got us to, validated on some level, but there's always added details when we talk to really smart people, is to say that you get someone who's more of a front post golfer, which would be like Zach Johnson or Aaron Baddeley, or two longest hitters on tour right now would be Cameron Champ and Bryson DeChambeau. So what's going to happen is they're going to use, like I said before, more rotation and vertical force. If you as my friend Matt Rudy says, you've got 3 dials and you've got to turn one up and one down, and you got to make it work. I think when people get force plates, they turn them all up, which doesn't necessarily work for everybody, right? Because as we mentioned before, it has an effect on the plane, it has an effect on when the face releases, and then you've got somebody like Vijay Singh, for example, or Martin Trainer, and they shift much more to the right. And so if you look at the need of the player, when they shift to the right, they've got to push laterally, right? So they're going to keep more knee flex, which you need knee flex in order to access kind of the muscles of your glute. So let's go bads first, up to you, whatever order you want to do.
No, sorry, it's just my computer's horrible. So
yeah, so you can
pull up whatever I can.
You can look at these two guys, and they couldn't be more opposite, right? So you look at Martin's got a reasonably strong trail hand grip.
And both of his hands are definitely turned to his right quite a bit.
The start of that swing, unfortunately. But he's got a little bit of that kind of Dustin Johnson forward press move at the start where he sets it early. And then, so let's just talk about his low body action. Where are we going on this? So, yeah, so if you watch his pelvis and, kind of pressure shift, you were talking to Mike the other day, pressure shift and sway are kind of interchangeable. He'll have pretty close to 100% shift pressure. And so as a rear post golfer, if you just think of it in terms of time, he takes more time when he goes over there to come back, right? And so what we're going to see is his, pressure shifting back to the left later than Aaron Baddeley, for example.
Yeah. Can you help me with this one? The pelvic sway. Have you measured him on an 8?
Yeah, I haven't got it in front of me, unfortunately. Is that all the way to the top? Yeah, unfortunately, it's just a line. But
it's just short.
I would say he'd be about 1.5 inches away from the target using AMM, calibration. Yeah, like I say, he's what we call a rear post golfer, and then he'll move in. So we're working to get him, make sure he gets onto his front foot enough.
Yeah. Do you talk at all about his left knee with him, the location relative to his ankle at this point in time?
A little earlier than that, to be honest. I would say probably left arm parallel to the ground. You'd want to see it on top of the ankle, because that's going to be the point at which he starts, his maximum torque, which basically is shear force. Kind of if he was standing on the ice and his right foot would slip back, kind of Greg Norman-esque, that would be the maximum torque. And so even just before that.
So I think when you're trying to put that into a picture on the downswing, when your left arm is parallel to the ground, your left humerus, it's about the point in time where you want your knee over your ankle and your knees flexed. So most they're going to be on the downswing. Yeah.
So as you guys know from the data that you see, that's actually the point in the swing where the hips are moving at the fastest, believe it or not, and rotationally.
Absolutely. And
so, when you start talking about trying to open up and what have you, he's already at his maximum pelvis rotation speed. I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions about golf, to be honest with you, is that, everyone's trying to open up the hips. You got Rory McIlroy, his hips are actually going back.
Closing.
Yeah.
So turning away from the target.
Yeah. And so I think you get guys that have got a very high kind of power to weight ratio, you're going to see that with.
Yeah.
So, because at that point they've, so at this point his hips are moving at maximum speed. When his club gets to parallel to the ground, his maximum vertical force.
Correct. So pushing off the ground, straightening his ankles.
Depending on the player, and obviously this I think is actually kind of a knockdown shot. You're going to have people off the ground at this point. So how much can they actually open up while they have no connection to the ground, right?
Right.
So
can you help me with this one? Because I see it all the time. I've got it seems really popular amongst the teachers who maybe post on Instagram a lot. Open. I don't see that correlation between good players and bad, and I certainly don't prescribe that for someone like the average golfer who might be watching this. The last thing they should be worrying about is how open their hips and shoulders are at impact.
Yeah, I think so. Actually, if you get bads to impact, you'll see a pretty big difference because of the grip, basically, as I mentioned before. So you're going to see, I mean, he's letting out his shaft a little earlier.
Matt, did you see that pause? I hit play and pause, and it's that impact. Did you see that?
Click it one more forward for me. And
I wasn't quite where you wanted it. All right.
See just the elbow positions is pretty different. Look at his trail hand grip position and versus trainers is more under the shaft.
That was actually part of the test for the Golf Digest Top 50.
I missed it by about 3 feet, so I failed. I'm in the top 5,000.
That's interesting. And here's an observation of Aaron's swing. First, you've got his pelvic and thoracic sway at the top of the swing, much more toward the target than you mentioned with trainer. But his knee relative to his ankle, how much more forward that is. And you talked a bunch in the past about how Aaron's using the vertical force. And it's very evident in this picture how straight his legs are. Yeah, that was always the part.
And straight arms, right?
Yeah, the part that always amazed me was how hard, like some of the longest drives I've ever seen were him 10 years ago with an old ball, old club, just mashing these things.
Yeah, he's a great athlete. Yeah. So anyway, I've got a little bit off topic because we were talking about low body action.
That's all right.
So just to summarize, kind of low body action, what we're talking about with Duffy is someone who's a rear post golfer like Martin is going to, the pelvis is going to shift more to the right. The trail leg in the backswing is going to be the most bent out of the spectrum in order that they can push laterally first. So, so he needs to keep some flex because when you keep 20 degrees of flex in your trail leg, or any leg actually, it engages your IT band, which engages the glute muscles, right? Whereas somebody who, is a little bit more centered, it's less flex, and then somebody who's more on the front leg, they're the least amount of flex. They straighten.
Do you prescribe for a lot of amateur golfers to have a backstroke hip sway like trainer here? And the caveat to that one is because of the rear knee flex that he's maintaining in this, his thoracic mobility is somewhat limited as well. The amount that he can raise the butt end of the club into the air is very limited. This isn't like the longest way to hit a golf ball from the data that we see.
128.
He hits it hard for sure.
I know he's an athlete. So I think you look at distance. You've got the way that we would approach it is matching up things first, and then making sure that the timing of the lower body is good, and then increasing range. So by increasing range, obviously you increase the time that you are able to put force into the club. So if you take someone like Martin Trainer, and I agree with you that when you have more knee flex, it definitely restricts your total amount of rotation, right?
Sure.
So some of the things we might do for him if he was a more restricted person with less speed, when someone's a rear post golfer, we prefer that they flare their trail foot more. If you look at Bad's right foot versus trainers, and the trail foot flare encourages translation, but also obviously encourages the pelvis, through the leg to rotate more.
More mobile.
Big fan of releasing the left knee, left foot for especially, think of someone like Bubba Watson, how his knee is just translating like crazy. Yeah. And I think that gives people, their personal 90 degrees. There's consequences for the upper body action. Martin's going to have, double reason to have a slightly flatter shoulder plane than Bads, for example, who's got a double reason to have a steeper shoulder plane. So, somebody with a trail hand grip that's weaker, they want to keep the hand, look at the difference of the position of their trail elbow, for example. And, so higher trail elbow usually leads to a little bit steeper shoulder plane, front post, obviously a little bit steeper shoulder plane. Somebody like Martin, especially if they're an amateur golfer, when they translate into the rear leg, they definitely reach end range. And especially if they have a stronger grip, they're going to release their posture just a tiny bit. So, which actually doesn't hurt them that much because it enables them to get their trail elbow, more in front of the hip on the way down, believe it or not, because it actually presets the trail shoulder lower. Right. So if I have a strong grip and a ton of side bend, effectively I've shut my face too much, and I'm going to have to find something on the way down to open it.
Yeah. Hey Nick, I'm curious how this relates to some of your studies and data. Kind of what you guys have found. I would just be curious to hear some of your thoughts.
Sure.
On that.
Sure. So it's interesting to hear Terry talk about these different tour players, and Martin in particular, how hard he hits the ball. The last thing he's really worried about at this point in time, I'm sure, is adding another 10 yards to his driver swing. So if they're going far like this, keeping it in the fairway, hitting some good short irons, that's what's important to him. Our average player who swings their driver 80 miles an hour that walks in, always trying to give them any kind of range of motion and some more degrees of freedom than what you can have. So I totally get how if Martin Trainer came to me, that is like the farthest away from my particular swing model I would make. If Martin came to me, I still wouldn't even bother talking about his backswing unless it was something that was important. But for the average player, this is what we're talking about when we describe sway, and Terry's mentioned it a few times. So the system that we have developed by Phil Cheatham, who's doing the work with Terry too, the pelvic sensor sits right here on your sacrum, just about in that spot. And then in the backswing, because you do turn and your pelvis can move toward or away from the target to some degree, and then there's even a degree of how much you're bent forward from your hips, will influence where the sensor moves to. The better players that we see in this example, it starts basically on that hyphenated line that's drawn through my friend John here, and then moves towards the target. It's really hard to move the sensor away from the target. The correlation to
it's
skill.
just the way the math is, right?
Yeah, you just can't do that. So the correlation to skills, that the worst golfers that we see right here, where I'm calling that out, move the hip sway about 2.5 inches towards the target at the top of the swing. Then the most popular picture on the internet, the most important one, I think, by our friend called it, most important picture on the internet is the better players on average move 3.9 inches to 4 inches for our best amateurs towards the target. So that 1.5 inches is what makes it interesting. And this graph, though, is the one that I like the most, Terry. This is essentially, this is 100,000 people on the same graph. So it's a really cool way to visualize data. It's basically a heat map, or however you'd look at the weather. So where you see dark blue, no one plays golf like that. 0 people. Then where you start to see the more dense areas, that's where there are more people doing that. So you've got the handicap on the x-axis. The worse you are, you can see this trend. And this one isn't nearly as defined as some of the other graphs that we have for measurements. But this one is, the further away you are from the target, on average, the higher your handicap is. But what I find interesting, and I hope you do too, Terry, is what I want to get your take on. As the players get better, not only is their hip sway tend to be more towards the target, but there's a negative non-correlation to hip turn. So that isn't even a variable. That's the one I don't say that at all.
Right.
I kind of like the fodder of it all, of taking that variable and letting it be a secret. But the golfers, good or bad, have their hips turned basically the same amount at the top of the swing, irregardless of handicap.
Right.
So that variable comes out. So this is pretty close to the location of the pelvis is what you're looking at here, the center of it. Now, as you get really good, you see that the best players hover around 4 inches, and there aren't too many outliers even. And if there are, it tends to be more toward the target. So I don't see good players moving their pelvis really far away very often. Like, I think Martin Trainer would fit on this graph fine. He would probably be right about where my cursor's at, a little further away than that really hot red spot. But I like this for people to get a good grasp on where to put their hips at the top of the swing. So I think what you're doing with Aaron would probably put him down here, maybe at the.
That particular picture, I think he was exaggerating.
Yeah,
so he'd almost on the sky blue there.
Yeah, it's pretty far toward, but he plays really nice that way, and I think there's a reason for that. It's really the lateral force that you need on the downswing is a harder one to time. How long to do it, how fast to do it, how long to stop.
Right.
Yeah, for him is the complicated part. So you're almost taking that lateral force out.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's what we do, but we do measure and kind of prescribe it for different styles. I would say, when you start getting data of bad golfers, let's say, or recreational golfers is the way we should say it. You're looking at obviously a whole pot of stuff, right? And and especially the concept of moving the implement with any kind of speed. I think as you become more skillful, you become more capable of disassociating kind of the pieces. And so, lower body can do something, upper body can do something. Whereas, initially, people kind of move it like an axe, right? They're just kind of swinging that thing, and using everything to do it kind of thing. So I think
very stoic, and what all this data really tells the story of is that the best players move themselves around a lot more than the worst players in every dimension: the side bend, the turning, the tilting, the bending backward, and the sagittal plane. It's just crazy how much they move around. But you're right, brand new golfers come in and they barely move themselves at all because they don't really understand or have acquired that motor program yet.
Yeah, and I spend a lot of time freeing up people's arm swings because and timing it then with a low body action. If you look at a video, it looks quote unquote stable and solid, and but the reality is, because motion is important, right? And it's a very dynamic action that like riding a bike. If you ride at a certain speed, you look like you're very stable, but you're moving very fast, right? And I think over time, especially with the video age, people have overly restricted things, to make them look stable, but it's like sitting still on a bike. You just, kind of fall off.
Yeah.
But I think the magic.
I'd love if the data actually supported that, but it tells you the opposite story that you're hinting at for sure. Some of these graphs would be interesting to show you, though. I do have a few that demonstrate that the best players do some of these variables exactly the same, and there's no deviation in it. So I'd be curious to get your take on some of those. I don't have any of them sitting right here in front of me, but
no doubt on that one day.
Yeah, those are the fun ones. And then I'm working on something else that I think will be cool. We're using Phil's 2-sensor system right now, but we're working actually on an optical system that we're getting pretty close to being able to alpha test or beta test even in some locations that are there are no sensors, and it's making a full skeleton out of you. And we're using gears as an extra layer, perhaps on
I think
the accuracy on that.
That'll
be cool.
I think the way that we do the testing, and we end up being able to predict a lot of the stuff.
Exactly.
Just kind of finishing off the thread where we were talking about how much you open up. It's very much kind of set in stone on some level, your capacity to do that.
Yeah.
I think it's, that would probably need to be part of a system where you're predicting everything. But I think it's, data is king, and I did a presentation at the Top 100 conference. You guys went for a beer because it was the last one.
I saw your name, and Cordy and I just got out of there.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I think you left with all the George's friends. Like it's like the ants, crossing the road.
That's right. No, that's one of the best things I appreciate about what you do is you're trying to measure things and trying to draw the correlative data from that and trying to not make it guessing. Golf instruction.
I forget where I was going with that.
I didn't get invited to that.
You got it. You can get invited to the Golf Magazine conference? That's so cool. I bet it was just lost in the mail.
So the question I ask, if you imagine we have, a lot of the top 100 coaches in America, and plus their guests who are probably pretty nerdy themselves. And the first thing I did, because everything I was going to say was going to be quite technically oriented in terms of measured, right? I mean, it seems like that's such a heresy for some people. But I said, how many of you use a launch monitor, right? How many use motion capture, force plate, whatever? And you have X amount of hands. I said, how many of you use some form of technology that you feel that made you a worse teacher? And, of course, no one raised their hand. They probably raised it on Twitter at some point. But,
silently.
Damn launch monitor made me worse. But the point being that, data and using technology and measuring things, I don't know many teachers who've done it for some time who feels like it made it more complicated. I think there's always a learning curve, which is probably the piece that people talk about where it's but we have a very predictable way of using technology, and when I do the initial assessment, I can pretty much give you the right launch monitor numbers, and most people fall into that unless they've been taught to do something else.
Sure.
And body shape of the swing, we can predict, like with Aaron, for example, that you're going to be more spin and launch dominant than you are horizontal, for example. And so all that kind of comes out in the assessment. And so the future of technology is, it's almost twofold: that predicting the outcome, which is potentially, that's really good science. If you can predict what's going to happen before it happens, then you got a pretty good model. We need that for the COVID, right? And then and then being able to measure it and then learn from the data, which it sounds like what you guys are going to be doing.
Yeah.
Cool.
That's what we're doing all the time, and you nailed it. The people who really are down on tech, pretty much everyone on TV who's been ruined by a bad golf instructor, Brandel Chambly to all those guys, just don't understand how the measurements actually make teaching golf simpler. But we spend all of our time talking about 6 degrees of freedom data, and then when you start to understand that, things get really simple, not complicated.
Yeah,
but you have to be a professional coach, or you have to do this for a living. You can't just be a hobbyist to really understand how sick stuff works.
Yeah, and I said it before that when the technology comes out, it's not doing what you're doing. It's not like a large body of data, right? It's an average, right? So how do I use this TrackMan thing? Oh, everyone's hitting up on it or whatever. Actually, the funny thing is when TrackMan came out, they had all of the attack angles and optimized ball flights for those attack angles, which was pretty cool, right? And then suddenly it disappeared. And then it was like PGA Tour averages. Right. And then now it's like just urban legend that everybody's got to hit up on it, right? And all of that stuff is not born out of blood, sweat, and tears of making people better and doing what really works. Because some people hit down on it and do really well, and then they have to close their stance to hit up on it. So
it's more complicated than just hit up on it, which I've seen so many. You have too, I'm sure, tour players who talk about I need to hit up on this thing more, and it's not just hitting up. You need to know how to do that. So.
Well, as you're excellent with is the 3-dimensional kind of plane. Ben Hogan's pane of glass, and some people have to aim right and around the corner.
Something's got to be more to the right.
Yeah. So you get guys like.
Oh well, thanks. I know you've got something coming up on Friday with Matt and Mike. Is that right?
We have. It's actually going to be free for everybody. It'll be 90 minutes. It's the ultimate golf lesson. And we're basically going to lay out our manifesto, as it were, with Matt. And he's excellent at directing our attention. So when you have two people with ADD, it's not easy to do. But he's a very patient guy, and he's very big. So I'm scared of him. No, but we're going to talk about, what's in our upcoming seminar. And that's the first session of the seminar is going to be streamed live on YouTube on my channel, Terry Rowles, and Facebook in the Golf Teaching Professional forum. Mm-hmm. And then from then on, we have, I believe, 11 more sessions where each session has its own theme. We're going to talk about testing, and we're going to talk about the grip. We have Sasha McKenzie and Phil Cheatham talk about the grip and the release and things like that. And then we've got, Scott Lynn, Mike Duffy talking about ground force, and Mike Adams, who you had on. I mean, he's such a unbelievably great ground force teacher. I've heard people say online in some of the interviews this week that, ground forces, you don't really need to look at it, and if you watch Mike, and, now I teach using the system, we get clubhead speed gains like you can't believe just through reorganizing the lower body action. It's not extra effort, it's just extra good technique. So, how to do it. Yeah. And we've basically as a group, we've pioneered an unbelievably effective system of generating, clubhead speed, which obviously has got to get translated out to the club. And then we're going to have a forum, which is actually 4 or 5 teachers of the year. And they're going to talk about how they use the system and how, Mike has been a mentor, and, so they do the testing, and they have a very successful teaching career through using it, including Kevin Kirk, who I'm an absolutely huge fan of.
That's great. No, Mike's been very influential in golf and done tons of productive, awesome things for teachers as well, just for the industry. Yeah. Matt, did you invite everyone from Golf Magazine to that?
Yeah, I did.
You did? Okay. All right. Well, I'll text Luke and D'Annunzio later and see what they see.
And it's ultimategolflesson.com is where you sign up.
Perfect. Awesome. And then how about social media? Anywhere people can find you there?
My Twitter is Golf Performance, and my Instagram is Terry Rowles, my name.
Very creative. I like your style.
Don't tell anyone.
Terry, we didn't get to, on my list of questions was to ask you about your golf lesson with Tim Ferriss. We'll do that next time you're on the show.
It was pretty cool. I mean, a lot of TV, I'll summarize it. Okay. He was terrible. And then he parred the last hole. So, and it was real, right? He said to me on the tee, don't tell me what to do, right? He hits 8-iron on like 160 yards to the middle of the green. and the greens were running like 12, right? And he putted it off the green all the time, and he kind of sklaff-toed it next to the hole and made a par. It's perfect.
Amazing.
Just as I drew it up.
You're a hero. You're a hero.
It was fun to spend a week with Tim Ferriss, though. He's a cool guy.
Oh, I can imagine, man. That's one of my favorite podcasts for sure.
Oh, yeah, he's terrific.
Cordy.
Awesome.
Take it away.
Nick, we'll see you next Tuesday.
Let's do it.
Thanks, guys.
We've got a full week lined up. Terry, Matt, thank you guys. Matt, thanks for hanging out with us this week. We had a good run this week. We had Mike, we had Ian and Jason on, and Terry, and we had some great conversations. It was fun.
Thanks for having me, and I'm glad to hear that everything's operational with Team Clearwater. So
crushing it, man.
That amount of sleep, probably, I guess.
I'm having a couple hours. I'm doing fine. No big deal. Makes this so much easier, Terry.
Congratulations.
Okay, see you guys.
Awesome. Yeah. We'll see you guys.